Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Wild, members of this subcommittee, thank you for this invitation and the honor to testify before you. Thoughts and prayers to the southern Brazilians who are going through a massive flood there. You all have my solidarity. On January 8, 2023, thousands invaded and vandalized the headquarters of 3 government branches in Brazil. This didn't happen out of nowhere. It was the result of a long process by which politicians, media influencers, and others, relying heavily on social media platforms, worked to discredit Brazilian institutions and spread 2 big lies. One, that the Brazilian elections had been defrauded and Lula da Silva, inaugurated a few days before, was illegitimate. Another, that given tensions in society and between government branches, the military had constitutional authority to take over. This was not the first violent action of Brazilian political factions unwilling to accept the results of the 2022 elections. In December, a few weeks after the votes had been counted and Lula was declared president, riots took place in the country, which included an attempt to bomb the Brasilia airport on Christmas Eve. The Supreme Court has been a special target of these extremists since 2020, when it ruled that the COVID policies that former President Bolsonaro planned to adopt were unconstitutional. "I've had enough," shouted Bolsonaro. He actually shouted, "Acabou, porra," which, in respect to this subcommittee, I'm not going to translate. Thereafter, Bolsonaro stood up against judges and even said in rallies that he was no longer going to respect court decisions. Others joined this call to confront justices on the streets and on social media. One of their mantras has been that the people are supreme. And in my written testimony, I provide with some pictures of demonstrations where this slogan features prominently. In this vision, courts must bow to what the people want. This is anything but a rule of law system, Mr. Chairman. It's actually a textbook definition of rule of man. As for the judiciary, it had to defend itself almost on its own. The chief federal prosecutor, appointed by Bolsonaro, and with the authority to investigate high officials, was refusing to do his job, as demonstrated in studies. Congress, under new leadership, was becoming ever more complacent with Brazil's authoritarian leader. One of the few resources available to justice was to initiate investigations themselves, which in 2019, interpreting Article 43 of the court's bylaw, they understood they had the power to do. Some of these investigations are still underway, and they have produced substantial evidence that there was a plan to stage a coup, including through depositions by the former Bolsonaro's aide-de-camp Mauro Cid and the former Air Force commander Carlos Batista Jr. The issues discussed in this hearing stem from this painful and complex context. Some question the decisions made by the Brazilian judiciary in those investigations, as well as in its capacity to oversee elections. They do so based on conceptions of freedom of speech that misrepresent Brazilian law and private files released by different sources. In my written testimony, I provide the subcommittee with a more detailed explanation of Brazilian law and why I see claims that Brazilians are living under a censorship regime controlled by a single Supreme Court justice, Mr. Alexandre de Moraes, as nonsense. I demonstrate, for instance, that Brazilian law fully allows judges to order the removal of social media posts and the suspension of accounts when those violate others' individual rights or the public interest. I also highlight that the authority of the Supreme Court to initiate investigations of online crimes against itself and against its members was recognized even by Bolsonaro's Solicitor General, Mr. André Mendonça, who currently sits on the court appointed by Bolsonaro. But in these initial and oral remarks, I want to make sure that we don't get lost among the trees and miss the forest. Is there a crisis in Brazilian democracy and rule of law? If there is, it's not because judges are trying to do their job, imperfect as they might be, as all other human beings. It's because we got very close to a point where judges would have become insignificant, subjugated by mobs unwilling to play by the rules of the game. And this, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Wild, is how democracy dies. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.